Меня зовут Фёкла Толстая, и я рада в качестве модератора начать дискуссию, которая имеет такой заголовок «Музей, волонтер и общество. Практика и перспективы». Идет прямая трансляция нашей дискуссии. Русскоязычную версию вы можете смотреть на Facebook-странице Ассоциации менеджеров культуры. Англоязычная версия нашей дискуссии, которая продлится 1,5 часа. Можете смотреть на канале YouTube и на Facebook-странице Ассоциации менеджеров культуры. Всех, кто нам присоединился, я призываю активно комментировать, задавать вопросы. У нас будет 3 части нашей беседы, и в конце каждой части я была бы очень рада, чтобы оставалось немножко времени, и мы могли бы вопросы аудитории задать. Итак, мы сегодня собрались для того, чтобы обсудить волонтерство, музейное и общество, и основным поводом к нашему разговору стал аналитический обзор «Волонтер, музей, общество. Политика и перспективы», который был инициирован благотворительным фондом Владимира Потанина по результатам конкурса «Музейный волонтер». Он проводился среди волонтеров российских музеев в 2019-2020 году. Оператором этого конкурса выступала Ассоциация менеджеров культуры. И об этом исследовании сейчас мы скажем чуть подробнее, но мы сегодня пригласили в дискуссии членов экспертной группы этого исследования российской части, и также международных экспертов из Соединенных Штатов и из Великобритании, которые тоже принимали участие, но уже не как исследователи, а как, собственно, с ними тоже проводили интервью и по тем вопросам, которые касаются исследования. С удовольствием представляю тех, кто сегодня собрался в нашем Zoom-совещании. Начну с Оксаны Орочевой, генерального директора благотворительного фонда Владимира Потанина, Россия. Оксана, может быть, вы поднимете руку, чтобы наши... Или скажете нам здравствуйте, если хотите.
И здравствуйте.
И здравствуйте, да. Оксана Фодина, директор программы благотворительного фонда Владимира Потанина, Россия. Оксана здесь, надеюсь, что с нами. Георгий Никич, куратор, разработчик и консультант программ развития институций культуры, преподаватель факультета управления социокультурными проектами Московской высшей школы социальных и экономических наук, известный всем как Шаненко, член правления Международной ассоциации искусствоведов и критиков. Георгий, может быть, вы поднимете руку и... Да, отлично. Но ваш красный свитер очень заметен, он будет таким лоцманом в нашей дискуссии. Оксана Мороз. Оксана, добрый день, добрый вечер.
Добрый день, добрый вечер.
Да, культуролог, доцент кафедры менеджмента и культурной политики Высшей школы экономики, тоже представитель российской части экспертов. Алиса Максимова. Алиса Максимова. Добрый день, добрый вечер. Социолог, младший научный сотрудник Института гуманитарных историко-теоретических исследований имени Полетаева, Россия. Скажите нам. Да, хорошо, отлично. Да, Юлия Мацкевич. Юлия, добрый день. Да. Если вы включите микрофон на секунду, то ваш экран станет самым большим, и все поприветствуют. Да. Музейный педагог, руководитель направления музейно-проектной деятельности Ассоциации менеджеров культуры и куратор конкурса «Музейный волонтер». Мне хочется назвать имя еще одного эксперта, Нана Житяшвили, искусствовед и психолог, которая представляет Россию и Великобританию. Она входила в состав экспертный, который готовил этот доклад, но ее сегодня в дискуссии нет. Алексей Бойко, главный специалист по музейной образовательной деятельности Государственного русского музея Санкт-Петербург. Алексей Григорьевич, добрый день. Рады вас видеть. Инна Прилежаева, социокультурный проектировщик, исполнительный директор Ассоциации менеджеров культуры, операционный руководитель проекта «Музейный волонтер» благотворительного фонда Потанина. Инна. Да, какая же прекрасная библиотека у вас за спиной. Наверняка все про какие-нибудь музейные, культурные, волонтерские проекты. Надеюсь, что когда-нибудь будет такая русская библиотека на эту тему. Наши гости зарубежные. Ричард Харкер, исполнительный директор Американской ассоциации музейных волонтеров. executive director of the American Association of Museum Volunteers.
Добрый день. Мэтью Хик, руководитель волонтерского направления в группе музеев науки и председатель сообщества волонтеров наследия из Великобритании. Рада вас приветствовать. Меня зовут Фёкла Толстая, я уже представилась. И я хотела бы попросить некоторые вступительные слова сказать Оксану Орочева, генерального директора благотворительного фонда Владимира Потанина, по инициативе которым фонд вообще много занимается вопросами волонтера, конкурсы и так далее, и по вашей инициативе было предпринято это исследование. Пожалуйста, Оксана.
Добрый день, дорогие друзья. Я буквально хотела несколько слов сказать, почему тема музейного волонтерства, в частности, волонтерства вообще более широкая тема, является сегодня для нас очень актуальной. Фонд на протяжении многих лет поддерживает российские музеи. Как вы знаете, в самых разнообразных проектах у нас так или иначе возникали темы волонтеров. Может быть, они не всегда были таким образом представлены, артикулированы, отрефлексированы, но во многих проектах, да, наверное, в каждом проекте в том или ином виде тема волонтерства присутствовала, потому что мы говорили, например, о народных кураторах или о привлечении студентов или школьников в проект и так далее, и так далее. И когда мы говорим о том, что музей сегодня это больше, чем музей, это еще и общественный институт, является связующим таким звеном между музеем как центром хранения и обществом в целом, то, конечно, тема волонтерства, она приобретает еще большее значение. И несколько лет назад мы предложили новую номинацию сначала на Интермузей по поддержке музейного волонтерства, и так стали поддерживаться уже целенаправленно проекты. А 2 года назад предложили отдельный конкурс «Музейный волонтер». Я бы сказала, что оба года конкурс скорее проходил еще в пилотном формате, потому что через конкурсную призму мы хотели посмотреть, о чем же сегодня занимаются музейные волонтеры, какими темами они интересуются, куда их привлекают, что они делают, как устроено взаимодействие между волонтерами и музеями, какие люди приходят в музейные волонтеры и многое другое. И я помню нашу дискуссию по результатам, вот, собственно, второго конкурса, когда стало понятно, что одного конкурсного инструмента для понимания этого феномена явно недостаточно, что мы, оказывается, этот феномен намного, с одной стороны, больше, и значит, его надо осмыслить, а с другой стороны, необходимо более его точно очертить, потому что музей всегда работает с аудиториями. И где вот эта грань проходит, работа с аудиторией, волонтерство, сообщество и так далее. Собственно, таким коллективным творчеством, вернее, это получилось такое коллективное творчество, в результате которого родилась идея исследования и обсуждение этой темы уже за рамками конкретного конкурса. И, наверное, это лучший результат конкурсной поддержки, о котором можно мечтать, когда кроме поддержки конкретных людей, музейных волонтеров, о чем отдельно мы всегда говорим, мы еще стали смотреть и более глубоко на среду, что представляет из себя музейное волонтерство. То есть здесь совпало как бы и наше желание отрефлексировать, и необходимость этой рефлексии, потому что конкурс ее ярко выявил, и интерес к этой теме. Конкурс также выявил, что музейное волонтерство сегодня интересно всем. Это и сами музеи, и люди, которые приходят в музей в качестве волонтеров, и некоммерческие организации, с которыми музей сотрудничает. И, собственно, пандемия, наверное, заставила нас еще больше посмотреть и обращаться к этому феномену, ведь музейное волонтерство не исчезла из нашей жизни, когда музеи, собственно, были вынуждены закрываться. Оно, наоборот, стало приобретать еще новые черты. Собственно, это то, что дал толчок исследованию, это то, почему мы этим занимаемся. Мы уверены, что музейное волонтерство – это как раз про музей и общество, про связь музея и общества, с одной стороны. Это про личную социальную ответственность людей, которые приходят в музей для того, чтобы помочь другим и готовы делиться. И это про, собственно, социальную ответственность самого музея, который помогает людям вписаться в общественную жизнь. И сегодня мы только, я думаю, начинаем этот разговор такой более глубокий, потому что сейчас у нас уже есть результаты исследований, но на этом точно он не закончится. Этот разговор будет требовать дальнейшего продолжения. Вот, наверное, основное, что хотелось бы сказать в начале нашей дискуссии.
Спасибо большое, Оксана. Вы какие-то, мне кажется, очень важные векторы сейчас заложили. И, собственно, по каким-то направлениям и будет строиться наша дискуссия. Мы постараемся посмотреть на волонтерство сначала с точки зрения музея, потом с точки зрения общества и самих волонтеров. Меня очень порадовало из того, что вы сказали, что существует уже среда, потому что особенно рядом с зарубежными коллегами мы должны признаться, что все-таки музейное волонтерство довольно новое в России вещь. Да, в Эрмитаже с 2003 года работают с волонтерами, но тем не менее новое, и уже есть среда. Вот, очень хорошо, что эта среда теперь получила какое-то описание. Я попрошу, наверное, Инну Прилежаеву продолжить, и надеюсь, что... у вас даже есть презентация, отлично. Несколько цифр и вообще какие-то краткие, самые важные, интересные выжимки из того, может быть, сосредоточить свое внимание на том, чего мы не ожидали, что расходится с каким-то стереотипным представлением о том, что за музейное волонтерство.
So what's a museum volunteer society like? I will try to describe the architecture of our research and the materials we've worked with. We had 145 participants in the research. I mean, people who work in the museums. However, I mean, this was not probably as many as we've expected, but the volunteers were very active. We had 376 volunteers who participated in the online survey, and we've built up our research as follows. We did some research analyzing museum programs, analyzing cases. We conducted anonymous survey in the museums, in the museums of Russia, and also in the among the volunteers. We conducted a survey among the volunteers, and you can see that this database we've collected have a lot of questionnaires filled out. We have interviews conducted. We had experts from 3 countries who talked about the international context for museum volunteering. And here I have to refer to our colleagues from the UK, from the US, and also from Canada. Apart from the textual review, we also presented 2 reviews of practices, museum practices for volunteering programs, and also we took stories from the winners of our volunteers competition. We took their cases to research, and we were very happy to learn that we had different museums, and you can see that distribution is pretty even. We had 30% of respondents from the museums, from larger museums, from bigger cities. About 25% of the respondents come from smaller towns, and 30% was covered by those working in smaller towns and in the village settlements. So we also had an even distribution between municipal and regional museums and federal museums as well. We also had very different museums in terms of their scale. we wanted to look at the museums in the regions because when you look at larger museums, it's pretty clear. Because larger museums have already been working with volunteers. And here you can see that we had like five groups of the museums in terms of the number of staff. About 35% of the respondents come from smaller museums with 10 or fewer people working there. And you can see that museums also are very different.
To specialized memorial or literature museums. What can we say about the volunteers who, the 365 volunteers who participated in this questionnaire? Their average age is 35 years. It's a rather young audience, and our main stake here is that the older people maybe are less active in the social media. And we also need to mention that online questionnaire took place in June, July, August 2020. And we see also a 50% ratio between temporary volunteers or permanent volunteers who have a long-standing relationship with their respective museums of several years. And most of our volunteers, 75%, have a university degree, and geographically, 25% are people living in the two major cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, and 75% is regional, 25 is regional centers. So we can see here that the statistics is quite corresponding here. So, well, to conclude, I would say that I will show you this slide on the question of how the pandemic influenced the attitudes towards volunteering programs. So let's see what were the answers. After the first wave of the pandemic, we see those answers. July, August, it was the time of, big optimism, I would say, still persistent at the time. In the 60% of museums that took part in the research, the volunteering activities stopped completely. 2% of the respondents, however, said that that was the exact moment when they started volunteering programs in their museums. So the pandemic, and it's curious, among most museum employees, it didn't really change anything in their attitude towards volunteering activities in the museum. But let me repeat that it's July and August. That was then. I would rather like to see how would they answer now. So I have a lot of figures, a lot of numbers, but I have to conclude by saying that all this massive of data, which I have just presented to you, will be uploaded to the Potanin Foundation website, and we hope that this data can be used for further research.
Да, Инна, спасибо большое. Но у меня сразу возникает вопрос, если есть на него короткий ответ, насколько данные, скажем, по музеям соотнесены в принципе с музейными данными России, то есть кто из какие-то музеи активнее принимали участие в анкетировании. То есть, мне кажется, вы сказали про 145 музеев, могло бы быть и больше. Я думаю, что тем, кому нечего было ответить, те просто как бы аккуратно и отмолчались.
The offer to participate, to answer your questions. You see, our this questionnaire was anonymous, and it was extremely important to us. So our urge to participate, our call, maybe those who got involved, yes, those are people involved in this issue, for whom this topic is not that peripheric, I would say. So, but I want to stress the fact that 145 those are not museums. Those are questionnaires filled by museum employees.
Те, кто участвует, потому что неловко посылать хоть и не
Well,
подписанную анкету, но
even if it's anonymous, sometimes one that wouldn't want to send in a questionnaire where you only answer no, we don't have volunteers.
Начнем
So
говорить о
now we
специфике
will
музейного волонтерства,
start
есть ли
getting
она
deeper into
вообще,
the specifics
потому что,
of
скажем, если
museum
обратиться к,
volunteering.
ну, например, к цифровым технологиям в музее, то
Digital
цифровики
technologies
всегда
in the
говорят, ну,
museums. All the
музейщики
digital
ищут
specialists
специфику
always
во
say
всех
that
сферах, но при этом
museum people
она не
want
всегда есть.
to have any
Цифра
field
там, и в Африке
that they
цифра.
deal with
Что касается
specific and
волонтерства,
want to
если
do
это
it
специфика,
differently.
я
I mean,
хочу попросить
I
Алису
would like
Максимову,
now to ask Alisa
начать
Maximova, a sociologist, to tell us
разговор на эту тему. У нас с вами
about
минут
this.
20
I mean,
на
is
этот раздел.
digital,
Буду рада вашей
is
лаконичности.
museum
Хотелось бы, чтобы больше
volunteering
людей
specific?
высказались. Пожалуйста.
How is it different from volunteering in other fields? Thank you. I will share several observations about the specifics. There are sound problems, I'm sorry. As for the interviews that we have heard, the in-depth interviews as well, museum volunteering.
Плохая связь, Алиса.
Yes, the connection is very
Плохо вас
poor.
слышим. Может быть,
We can't really figure
закрыть
out
лишние вкладки
what you were saying.
браузера или что сделать?
Close your browser tabs or do something to
Попробуйте
have a
что-нибудь
better
закрыть
internet
лишнее.
flow. Well,
Не помогает. Давайте хотя бы мы будем на вас смотреть и
really
читать по губам. Поехали дальше. Алиса отключила микрофон. Это, кстати, улучшило звук. Давайте попробуем еще раз. О!
Okay, now it
намного лучше. Вкл-выкл работает. Давайте.
So I want to say that, first of all, the status of volunteering movement or volunteers in the museum is quite unstable and quite uncertain. Only 20% of museums who responded and filled in our questionnaire have an institutionalized volunteering program inside their strategies. I mean, institutionally, it's not well defined, the volunteering, and it's very flexible. Let's say when the person responsible for volunteering goes to another organization or switches to another project, the same percentage, around 20% of museums have a volunteering center or a special department responsible for volunteers. And in average, generally speaking, who is in charge of the volunteering projects? Those are the employees that are given this as an extra function. They have other responsibilities to take care of. And it's very useful here, I mean, that this in-depth interviews, they show the dynamics of the process and they show the evolution of volunteering programs. They help manifest the fact that quite rarely the museum employees who design and devise volunteering projects have a clear understanding from the outset what it will look like. I mean, the volunteering program, what will be the objectives and tasks given to volunteers. So it's quite a very dynamic, evolving, shifting phenomenon that is changing all the time, on the go, under the influence of the skills maybe manifested by the volunteers. It is also affected by how this specific institution at this specific museum for a number of years, well, you know, the employees, the staff develops a trust towards the volunteers and starts delegating responsibilities to them, starts sharing their tasks, because this is the barrier normally. Museum workers, museum staff have a difficult time understanding or admitting that volunteers are good at some things and sometimes are good at difficult things and at interesting
вот
tasks
эта избранность, которая есть всегда у музейного работника, что только я и никто, кроме меня, и я единственная свет. Я хотела спросить, Алиса, вот то, что это не формализовано и нет разнарядки, что нужно сейчас заниматься волонтером, то, что это происходит естественно и постепенно, по дороге решаются все психологические вопросы, это скорее плюс или минус?
Would that be an advantage or disadvantage? Is it good or bad? I would say that it presents a number of challenges. It is a work that is difficult to evaluate. Museum staff are not responsible.
Психологическое уговаривание себя, что
their job description,
психологическое уговаривание себя.
In charge of psychological support to other people. I mean, or psychologically dealing with themselves. I mean, self-reflections of immersion, that can be good, but I mean, there is a huge potential in that. I mean, ideally, that would revolutionize the museum practice. I mean, volunteering can make museums more open to the audiences, and many of the participants, many of the respondents mentioned that volunteering helps enhance the communication between the museum and the audience, make the museum more welcoming, more accepting. But to do that, we have to ask ourselves the questions about what is our position, what is our standing, how this practice is organized, and how we share our authorities and our responsibilities with
Спасибо большое. Тоже важные вещи, которые я надеюсь, что еще сегодня мы как-то обсудим и прокомментируем по поводу статуса, по поводу психологической понимания роли музейных работников и волонтеров, и одними, и другими. Я попрошу Георгия Никича, может быть, продолжить на тему специфики музейного волонтерства.
What is specific about volunteering in museums? Yes, well, continuing what Elisa has just said, I would like to say that museum volunteering in the statutes that we discuss it today and that we have it in Russia today is it's really very telling of our today's situation. And museums here, if I'm a museum, I hear that, okay, volunteering is fashionable now, that it's good. And I design a project according to my previous understanding, to the idea or prejudice that I have about it, preconception. So museum volunteering might seem to be something very simple. People perceive it as something unnecessary, non-obligatory, and that have a full power over as a museum. I would say that in the interviews, I can see that museum feels itself in a position of domination, non-dialogue position, because the museum wants to be in charge, wants to be in control. The museum is the one who is conserving and preserving the memory, the cultural values, and they translate it or communicate it to the society, while volunteering is a horizontal structure eventually, while museums are vertical. So I would say it's an ontological conflict, which is not reflected upon anywhere. And Elisa has mentioned that, because if we think further, we understand that we should have started with values and with discussing values. And this is not how it goes normally, because normally the discussion is, what are the volunteers' interests and what are the museum's interests and how do they correspond to one another? So, okay, well, now there is a flow of new experiences, and within this research as well, we tried to analyze this experience, this practice. So there is very rarely they ascend or reach a conceptual understanding of the part of the volunteering's mission within the museum's mission. So if we use a simple metaphor, we can think of a museum as a glass cup. So with a prismed glass, you see one side of the prism, And well, volunteering is one of those filters, one of those lenses that you can use to understand. So today, I think that this is something very new and it's very poorly defined. I mean, poorly delineated from adjacent areas, I would say, because inside the museum practice, volunteering is getting merged with other functions. It's not well determined or differentiated from other functions. It doesn't have its proper place, individual place. And I think it has to do with the fact that the value matters have not been addressed, the value issues that.
And those values that museum has to link with the volunteers' values, this is something that we rarely see in the museums. And there's no cultural framework for that, no technology for that. And this is where we find ourselves in an unstudied environment. And we have a lot of people in this field, working in this field, a lot of amazing volunteers, and the plants, metaphorically saying, these volunteers are planting, sometimes grow further and sometimes they don't. So they don't depend on institutions. They depend on their private initiatives. The initiatives suggested by the museum staff or by the volunteers themselves. And this phenomenon is still unstable. Why? I think my colleagues will tell you more about
что вы
it.
говорили, вот несколько вопросов. То есть на самом деле мы говорим об этой неочевидной вещи, плюсы и минусы. С одной стороны, отсутствие четкой грани, и что этот сегмент, и что она сливается с другими. С другой стороны, в этом есть что-то очень естественное и натуральное. Как в любом натуральном развитии нет никаких швов и граней. Почему волонтеры не могут сливаться, например, и смешиваться, скажем, с друзьями музея, например, по-моему, это очень там близкое пересечение. А с другой стороны, с аудиторией, а работа с аудиторией, о чем уже шла речь, похоже, и учится по работе с волонтерами. Но вот что я хотела спросить, вы говорите про ценности, про то, что для ценностей. Правильно ли я услышала, что хорошо бы, чтобы волонтеры как-то соотносились с ценностями, которые есть у самого музея? Приведу, скажем, примеры своей сферы. Я работала в музее Толстого, и волонтерство в ситуации, на примере, скажем, Льва Толстого имеет совершенно особый окрас, потому что Толстой сам занимался очень много волонтерством, и вообще идея того, что добрые люди должны объединиться, она очень толстовская. Говорите ли вы об этом как бы вот смысле и посыле непосредственно к музею, которая должна быть связана с волонтерской работой, да? Или я слышала что-то лишнее?
My answer will be very short. Yes and no, because it depends on whether the museum itself has reflected on the values they are projecting or it is projecting. I think that today the museum itself in many cases has not yet conceptually
Может быть, и в этом волонтеры нам могут помочь.
And maybe this is something where volunteers could help us.
Да.
Exactly, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So sometimes looking from outside gives you more information and more insight. Yulia Matskevich, I would ask you to join us because I know that you work in the field, so to say, and you have a lot of practical experiences. Maybe you could tell us more about volunteers in the museums and what is special about volunteers in the museum. I probably wanted to talk about one aspect or one feature. When we're talking about volunteering in general, we're talking about people sacrificing their time, their effort, energy, whatever. Do museum volunteers see their activities as sacrificing something, as offering something? it turned out that no, they sometimes see it as entertainment, as leisure activity, meeting other people, meeting other volunteers, meeting museum staff, meeting new people in general. One girl answered, for example, that she volunteers in a museum because this is where she sees adult professionals who devote themselves to work entirely, and she didn't have similar examples in her life otherwise. Now, there's an interesting project in the Gulag History Museum. It is called The Psychology of Care, where volunteers help victims of political repressions, both psychologically and in terms of, everyday life. They record their stories, their oral history, and these volunteers are helped by a professional psychologist, Valery Naumov. And this psychologist, he mentioned that their motivation is very different. So when answering a question, why have you become a volunteer? They say they wanted to be useful to other people. They wanted to gain self-respect. They wanted to realize they're not living in vain. But each volunteers finds something they need personally. Some people want to have a better understanding of their country's history. Others want to reflect on their own life and get to learn about their family history in this context. Some were thinking about the future, or trying to understand what was the outcome of their lives. So people have different motivations. This is what I wanted to say. I would like to ask our international experts. Can you hear me? Can you hear me all right? And ask Richard Harker, and ask, compared to the American experience, we're probably at the earlier stage of volunteerism movement. What ideas do you have when you're hearing what our museum community is discussing in terms of volunteers, and this question, this issue, whether we should formalize it, make it more formal, or how do you view it? Is it more natural or more formalized, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me today. And I wish I could speak in Russian so we didn't need translators, but alas, I can't. I think one of the things that I'll just reflect on that I forget who said it is this idea of vertical and horizontal. And I think in the United States in the last 50 or 60 years, there has been this movement towards museums sort of decentering or de-emphasizing their authority as institutions, and spending time engaging with the community, engaging in community collaboration and engagement. And so when we think about how volunteers fit into that, it's also natural, or it seems natural, that alongside that evolution, you have a growth in sort of volunteer programs, the professionalization of museum volunteer programs, and you have this institutionalization of volunteerism in American museums. Now, it's also true that in American life, in 2018, 77 million Americans volunteered on average 50 hours a year. So volunteerism, there is a larger cultural understanding and value of volunteering. But in museums, especially in the last 30, 20, 30, 40 years, there's been this greater emphasis on the professionalization of a volunteer program. More museums have hired volunteer managers, invested resources, and by which I mean mostly money, in volunteers, and the policies and the procedures and the practices and the protections that allow volunteers to succeed. And I think it's true in the United States that volunteers are vitally important for the health of museums, both in terms of the skills that they bring and the hours that they donate, but also in the connections that those volunteers can forge with the community. And so as we think about museums in the United States attempting to reflect their community and attempting to bring their community in, and not necessarily be the sage on the stage who tells people what to think, but invites many different voices and dialogue, you can understand that volunteers are a sort of important part of that evolution in American museums. And it should be said as well, of course, that the United States is a large country, and there's gigantic museums, small museums, rural, urban. There's a lot of diversity in American museums. But as I think about sort of these larger trends, what I heard about sort of this vertical rather than horizontal, that sort of really resonates with how I think American museums maybe have been shifting into that horizontal way, over the last 50 to 75 years.
Can I mix this vertical and horizontal and ask? We're talking about museum volunteers, and we see it in a sort of idyllic way. It's so great. Volunteers are so good. They want to do everything, donate their time, and American museums want to involve them. Are there no conflicts at all? How does it happen? And one more short question, money question. How when we need to talk about the money with an American?
Well, so the question about sort of conflict, yeah, I mean, I think one of the issues or sort of central important issues that has emerged in the last 20 years has been a development of best practices about how volunteers should operate within a museum program, how they should be recruited and trained and evaluated and sort of held accountable. But we know, when someone is volunteering their time, that is some of those things are harder to do than with a staff who you pay who have a contract. So there's definitely a tension there, and also, every volunteer program is different and is based on the values and the resources and the skills of those people at the museum managing volunteers. And I certainly know many small museums that have just one member of staff who are reliant on volunteers, and so maybe they don't have the energy or the money or the resources or the time to dedicate to sort of managing the volunteers in a way that a much larger institution with 2 or 3 volunteer managers might have. And so there's certainly a conflict and challenge. And I've always said when doing webinars or professional development training for volunteer managers, I've always said sometimes it's better to have no volunteers than have a volunteer who's in a bad situation, whether it's bad for the museum or bad for the volunteer. Some of the problems that can emerge from that type of a situation is it's not good for the volunteer, it's not good for the museum, it's not good for the staff. And so even though sometimes we have jobs that need to get done or work that needs to happen or experiences that we want to offer our visitors, certainly volunteer management requires attention. And I think one of the challenges has been that often volunteer programs haven't been given attention. And so it is just, it becomes somebody's job to look after the volunteers, even though really what we advocate is that volunteer management requires real training and skills and resources.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm not even asking about the money. I don't want to follow up on the money question. It would be great to know what Matthew thinks about it. I saw him nodding when we talked about issues, like someone who knows, while the Russian part of the audience was listening. But I mean, they were not nodding as heavily as you did. Why? does it mean we have fewer contacts with volunteers? We don't have those 77 million people that Richard mentioned. We have like these 356 people. Maybe our Russian colleagues could comment later. But my question to Matthew is about the specific features of museum volunteering, maybe something you could add to the discussion we've been having.
I was just well. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be back with you guys, and it's a real shame that we can't all be together in person. I was just nodding really at a couple of things Richard was saying at the end there. The first was around sometimes it is better to have no volunteers than negative volunteers, and that's something I would absolutely agree with. And what I've kind of found really interesting over my time in volunteer management, certainly when I started with Science Museum Group, we had, we were starting to professionalize, but for a variety of reasons, we'd let that flounder a little bit. And actually, I'd come into an organization where we had volunteers who hadn't been recruited properly, who hadn't been managed and supported properly, and therefore we had a lot of people who were a negative influence on the organization. And what that did was create this kind of culture of negativity around volunteering. And actually a challenging part of any good volunteer manager's job is to effectively take those people out of the organization. And that sounds really negative from a volunteer manager, but if you're trying to build a culture around volunteering, those people could do so much damage to what you're trying to achieve. And what I would say is, dealing with that and dealing with issue volunteers, and what Richard was saying at the end, which was kind of hinting at the need to resource volunteer management properly, is absolutely crucial to the development of quality volunteering experiences, to making meaningful and impactful volunteering programs for our museums. And this comes back to one of those very early points about values, about why are we involving volunteers? What is the purpose of volunteering in our organization? And for me, that's the absolutely fundamental question that every organization should ask themselves before it decides to start involving volunteers. And for a lot of people, it's about operational benefits. It's about what can volunteers do for us? How can they help us deliver tours within our organizations? How can they help us, catalogue the collection? But of course, volunteering can provide our organizations with so much more. And, we can think about, and we've touched on some of these topics already in our conversation. So things like volunteers, creating that connection with our communities, the networks those volunteers have can influence the sphere of influence that we have as an organisation. The expertise that volunteers can bring into our organisation are expertise that we may well not be able to staff ourselves. The experiences that people bring with them provide something that's called cognitive diversity. So the ability to problem solve from different perspectives. And again, because you're bringing people into your organisation who bring with them that different perspective, you can then problem solve far more effectively as an organisation. But that bond that we were talking about, kind of going out into the community and creating community bonds, that's certainly where we are as an organisation with Science Museum Group, and we're starting to see that far more, and the role that volunteers can play in helping solve problems within communities, problems that are being exacerbated by COVID-19. I mean, I was just reading a report yesterday that was talking about 500,000 people, young people being made long-term unemployed as a result of a lack of jobs within the UK. We have an opportunity to create, volunteer roles within museums that will provide those people with skills and experiences that will help them find employment. We know social isolation is already a problem with communities in Britain, but we can bring those people together and provide them with meaningful work and volunteering opportunities within our museums, and we can solve issues of of social isolation. There's so much that volunteering can do, but ultimately it all comes down to that that question of why are we involving volunteers and getting that organisational commitment to volunteering.
Matthew, thank you so much. Well, now I can see that discussion is much livelier since I started asking about problems and challenges. I can see such a liveliness in the participants' eyes. A lot of important issues have been mentioned. who is in charge? And Georgi asked about that. Who is in control? That the museums feel their domination, but when we talk about conflicts, we hear that, yes, I, the museum, involved you. Well, another important issue is how do we guarantee the quality of volunteers' work, and what are the criteria of assessment? Is it the only the assessment by the museum, or bilateral evaluation, or some extra social impact? So, I mean, what is a quality volunteer involvement? And since we've started talking about the social aspects, and since we have mentioned this terrible word pandemic, Matthew said that it led to a large unemployment. I will shift to the second part of our talk about the social role of volunteers within museums, and about 2020 and what it has done to us in terms of the COVID pandemic. But let me now ask another question to Richard, because Richard will have to leave us in 9 minutes. So Richard, please, could you tell us, how did the pandemic change things? I mean, you had a sort of a stable situation. Well, how did the pandemic change the volunteering landscape in the museum area?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's sort of two things that immediately come to mind. One is that obviously, as many museums have been on lockdown or various phases of lockdown, and as they have reopened slowly, and of course that's, you know, depending on the museums and where they are, that's really challenged the volunteer programs, especially if those volunteers are in a frontline capacity, giving tours or being in a visitor services capacity. And so, you know, I think what we've seen is that a lot of volunteer programs have really been put on hold. They've had a sort of pin put in them. And then the other challenge is that as museums, like so much of the economy in the United States, have really struggled, there's been many cuts and unemployment layoffs, and so often volunteer managers and other staff have been the ones on the receiving end of that. So, you know, I think we're in this situation where there's, you know, a lot of stress on our museums, and the volunteer programs are one part of that. But then it's also possible to imagine a scenario where, as museums reopen, as hopefully the pandemic, you know, ends sooner rather than later, that museums are going to increasingly need to rely on volunteers if they have these, you know, economic challenges or you know, that they're trying to recover from. You can imagine a situation where they are slow to rehire their staff, and they would sort of draw on their volunteers to give tours and act in some roles that perhaps once paid staff were in. And so it's a real challenge moment for museums and volunteer managers. And I certainly know many colleagues in a volunteer manager capacity who have been furloughed or laid off during this time. But I think the only other sort of thought that I have about how the pandemic explicitly affects volunteer programs is that maybe there is a silver lining that I've heard from some of my colleagues, that this moment of increased technological connection and Zoom and all these other methods that we're all so familiar with have helped our volunteers become, you know, more connected to us. And so now there are new mechanisms for training and education and orientation in this digital forum that perhaps before the pandemic people might have felt more wary of, or it might have been something that was a barrier to volunteering, whereas perhaps now it might actually be an asset that museums can use. But certainly, while the pandemic has challenged everybody in many different ways, I think the American volunteer sector has been badly hurt, and volunteer programs are a part of that struggle for sure.
But I will still ask about money. You said that volunteer managers have been furloughed or fired. So did you try to calculate in dollars, in US dollars, how much do volunteers contribute? You said that there are 77 million volunteers who donate 50 hours a year. So how many billions that would be worth?
Yeah.
Do you know a figure?
That's the United States, not just in museums, but that number is $193 billion of time that volunteers donated in the entire country. So whether it's a museum or a food service or whatever they volunteer. But so at my organization, Historic Oakland Foundation, we have over 300 volunteers. And last year, our volunteers donated over 18,000 hours, which is about over $400,000 of time to an organization that has a budget of about $3 million. So that's a significant percentage of investment that those volunteers make. And we couldn't do what we do, and we couldn't do our mission without them. And so, certainly we are trying to find new ways to engage and stay engaged with our volunteers, even while they're maybe not able to be there on site with us during these times of social distancing and the pandemic.
Richard, thank you so much, Richard Harker. We have to let you go now. So I have so many questions for you yet, but we will contact you. We will keep in touch after this discussion. So, well, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, everybody.
Thank you very much. Смотрите, отметьте, как Ричард очень точно.
Richard speaks. Well, he has the precise figures in numbers, in people, in the economic value. So, I mean, in Russia, would we be that specific in figures? Do we have that statistics? Do we know how to count and to calculate as well? So we'll keep talking about the current situation, and I will now ask Alexei Boyko to talk about how the pandemic changed museum volunteering. Well, thank you. First of all, we should, yes, of course, calculate the amount of hours and in money, but we would need to make a list of museum volunteering projects put on hold, because many of them were partly frozen, partly or totally. So what was archived? What programs survived and which of them didn't? So those are very pressing issues. Some of the museums have volunteering programs of health oriented. One of the foreign museums has programs where people suffering from dementia are involved into museum activities, but it's not for them, for the museum. It's for them to fulfill themselves as individuals. And I wonder if that program was put on hold or not. So, and yes, we should create a database, a list of projects put on hold. And I would also back the statement that was mentioned today, that it's all about values, general values, universal values, or, well, we say that the pandemic has highlighted the theory of new normalcy, and it's dichotomical and also legal aspects. There are laws on new normalcy adopted in various countries. So, I mean, volunteers that will work after the pandemic in the museums, we have to talk while training them. We have to discuss this issue. I mean, what would change? How will our lives change in general? So this is the COVID challenge that the museum volunteering faces today, and it's part of the larger cultural and ethical revision carried out by the European culture, the US culture, and Russian culture as well. And it has to do with the new definitions of what a museum is that we have recently discussed in the meeting of the International Museum Board. So the key question is, and I think we have to think, each specific museum has to think about it, and the museum community in general, but the phenomenon of museum volunteering, where does it emerge from the museum's will, or from a social demand for that, or museums' social functions and social responsibilities, and becoming part of an ecosystem in general? So let me reformulate. If a museum, let's say, doesn't feel the need to have volunteers, does that mean that it's short-sighted and that it's guilty in front of the society if it has no volunteering projects and programs? So I think that the pandemic poses the question of the place of volunteering programs in this larger new understanding or questioning on the role of museums in general. And we should have a look at the museum movement as a whole.
And to see not only museum volunteers in the museum, we have museums, we have people, we have volunteers from, football club in a museum. Museum volunteers, can they be part of other volunteer communities? And they, in this sense, they become envoys of the museums in other volunteers communities. So being, those volunteering communities, sports communities that are known for their emotional content, or neighbors who volunteer, people who live together, like local communities. A specific feature that pandemic has added to it is physical presence, physical interaction. For the museums, it's a matter of being present in the museum. A lot has been said about virtual and digital volunteering, but I think that after the pandemic, volunteers who've actually come to the museum will play a greater role, not only because they do something good for the museum, but also when they leave the museum, they take this energy of happiness, of meaningfulness, of being in the museum, regardless of the tasks they perform, but this very existence in the museum. And the last thing I wanted to mention, and it has been said today, I just want to emphasize that after the pandemic, we'll be able to use this digital culture of the younger generation, their communicative preferences. Here, we cannot remain where we were. Very interesting experience of the Polytechnical Museum shows that volunteers, so-called Silver Age volunteers and middle-aged volunteers, they're very active even during the pandemic. But the future, when it is all over, all those communicational skills that digital environment brings us or gives us, we need to use them to develop our volunteers projects. Thank you very much, Alexei. I think that you've touched upon several very important issues. We're talking about practical stuff, but we are making mental notes of the things we need to reflect more later, to reflect upon later. And, the values of the museum and the social contract and the interaction between different volunteer communities. Richard has mentioned it, that NGOs also act as mediators between the volunteers and museums when resolving some issues, but at the same time, they might be mediating and expanding this sphere, go beyond only museum volunteering. So as long as we've been talking about new uh, digital tech and young people in the museum, I would like to ask Oksana Moroz to tell us more. Alexei has been talking about things that have been put off or suspended, while I know that Oksana had to work with a digital project, and this pandemic has been good for for everything digital, and the museum digital museum has done a huge leap. So uh, how is digital volunteering doing? I know that uh, um, you worked on it while working on the research, but I will really welcome your comment. I think that the situation is really complex. When we're looking at the answers we get and at the deeper interviews, we realize that we have a huge potential for digitalization of volunteering work, but it is not always realized, this potential. On one hand, um, uh, things that are going on in the digital, in the museum projects in terms of project activity uh, works well with digital and virtual volunteers. We can use many words. We have digital, all kinds of volunteers, remote, digital, virtual, depending on the word we choose. We work with specific features of volunteering. Uh, well, this remote volunteering has to do with people being forced to do it, while virtual volunteering is often used when we want uh, to say that we have the same volunteers who work at the location, but they're in the virtual space. They're in our virtual archives, for example, or in our virtual databases. So when we're looking at how their work is different from here in Russia from what is usually called digital volunteering, there's no much difference. But when we're talking to real people and ask real questions, it turns out that although we don't see much difference in general, but in terms of understanding and accepting this of the fact of digital volunteering, there is a difference. On one hand, in our questionnaires, in our surveys, um, um, 35% percent of people said that, well, pandemic has changed volunteers' practices. 8% called these changes really serious, which means that the format of their work has changed, and only 2% of the people questioned uh, uh, said that those remote groups started to work indeed. So there's no direct correlation. We understand that in reality, when we're talking about digitalization, we see that there are certain uh, ways or conventional ways of work, and they're not seen as specifically pandemic ways. You know that you can contact volunteers through social networks, through social media. You know that you can create publics and chats to communicate with them. And when we ask whether this situation has changed, some say it hasn't changed at all. Some answer yes, and say that we're now talking through chats more, and we interact online more, and we do some checkups and meetings. We're having them online, but that does not mean that we have changed the way we see volunteering activities. It is a specific situation doesn't mean it should affect certain fundamental changes. What is also important, and I think it is significantly important, in certain institutions where you have where they work a lot with digital tools, uh, they are not always happy in calling people volunteers. They want to call them trainees to emphasize that these trainees are working closer with the institution, they're equipped with those digital tools, and they're involved in the development of those tools, and they're closer to the staff, to the museum staff. They're rather seen as trainees. Nobody promises them anything. Uh, uh, they promise only the things that you promise to anyone who helps, but it doesn't mean that they're becoming part of the museum community as members of staff. But this playing with words or playing with names is also very important. Other colleagues in their deep interviews said that in this social responsibility sphere, you need a lot of volunteers, IT volunteers, and but they forget about museums. They don't see museums as institutions that would need IT volunteers. And when you ask them why, uh, since there are no reasons to reject museums, it turns out that IT people don't really understand how museums works, and they don't really understand why would a museum need an IT volunteer and how they could be involved in the museum's work. So when we're talking about digital features or specific digital features and opportunities for digitalization, we do see new goals, new issues that we can and should resolve remotely. And trust, if you're not working remotely, you're not working at all in this sense. So understanding that digital in the museum's practices is not something random, is understanding that it could be a useful help, a useful tool that would help museums to develop, to evolve. Uh, this understanding is not always there. Uh, and I'm not only talking about some very traditional museums, I'm talking about some museums that are using digital tools already. We're maybe there's a comment from Svetlana Frolova from the Kazansky University Museum, and she's writing that during this lockdown we had volunteers in the museums where we didn't have them or hadn't have them before. I'd ask Yulia Maskevich to follow up. We know that you've been working together with Nana Zvitiashvili. I'm talking about the psychological side of this whole thing that has to do with the pandemic. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Usually, when we're talking about the outcomes or of the volunteers' work in the museum, people want to see what kind of gaps they cover. We don't have resources, and now we have volunteers who would uh, meet the guests, welcome the guests, and help to distribute the chairs. They'll do something that museum staff doesn't have time for, but it would be. And they would be usually talking about something which is very, very simple, something that museum staff doesn't want to do. Well, it is not always the case, but once a museum begins to work with volunteers, it starts usually when you have museum night, when you know that you have too many people coming, and you'll collapse if you don't have help from outside. And it's very seldom when a museum in Russia would see volunteers as volunteers' activities as contributing to the well-being of the volunteers themselves. If museums see themselves as recipients of volunteers' help only, they don't see this focus, they don't have this focus on the well-being of volunteers. Could you give an example? Could you give a case or an example about this volunteers' well-being. When we're talking about well-being, I mean, I'm meaning it in a broad sense. I'm not talking about the paying them, or I'm talking about psychological and physical comfort that people experience in the museum. Nana Zvitiashvili, she's working in Russia and in the UK, and she refers to British experience. She's an art historian and then a psychologist, and she leads a psychological aid program. She sees these effects, and this part of the research is very interesting, is captivating. Interacting with the cultural heritage, being part of cultural heritage, helps people feel more satisfied about their lives. It helps them see their lives as valuable.
And in 2018, in the UK, there were 5 ways to well-being. It sounds quite religious. 5 ways to well-being that were published in the UK. And when someone can have meaningful connections with others, when this individual can be active and is active, when he or she has an opportunity to live life, a mindful life, seeing and understanding what's around her, and when she or he keeps learning new things and helps others and is part of a community in this process. Well, bingo. This is the museum volunteer, what you just described, yes. And when the museum trusts the volunteer and respects the volunteer, and it's a horizontal, friendly cooperation, when the rules are clear, when hearts are open on the both sides, I would say yes, those are the ways that volunteers, the roads that the volunteers could make to the museums, the ways. Well, Yulia, thank you so much. And since we are now discussing UK and their experiences, Matthew, I would like to ask you would you want to add something to what you have just heard? And the general question was about how the pandemic changed museum volunteering activities in the UK and in the world in general.
Yeah, sure. And I've just prepared something for this, so I might as well go through that first. So, I mean, traditionally, volunteering in the UK, like we've kind of touched on already, it's kind of been very much focused on the operational benefits that volunteers provide to the organisation. So like we've just discussed, how might they help on an evening event? How might they help us catalogue the collection? But over the last 10 years, things have started to change a lot within organisations, with organisations starting to understand that volunteers can provide, and volunteer programmes can provide wider strategic and social benefits. And this has been driven in part by changes in the political landscape within the UK, so cuts to funding to museums and other third sector organisations that have been driven by years of austerity, and this has forced organisations to think differently about who they work with and how they deliver and what they deliver. And these changes have also been driven by funders who, because of this kind of shifting political landscape that we've seen, have placed greater emphasis firstly on volunteering and then kind of more latterly on well-being, as we've just talked about, inclusion and diversity. And all this has been done to tremendous effect, I would say. But sadly, the issues that we face today in the UK are only likely to be exacerbated by the impact of COVID-19. So as I've mentioned already, a recent government report, which was released a couple of months ago, kind of estimated that about 500,000 young people may face long-term unemployment. And I think when you couple this with existing issues around social isolation, lack of community cohesion, issues of mental health and an ageing population, the future appears bleak. But, I would argue, volunteering can contribute to this solution, and in fact I would argue that it must contribute to the solution. And I would say I believe
very strongly that through our volunteer programs, we can offer training and work experience that will help people develop skills and find work. We can bring people together from different backgrounds and communities to create this greater sense of social cohesion. We can give people that most human of things, which is connection, with us, with our museums and other people. And these are kind of themes that seem to be coming out and resonating very heavily today. And by thinking about doing this, how we do this strategically, we can ensure that not only are we doing this and we're providing these social benefits, but we can do it in a way that provide operational benefits for us. So we can by recruiting the right people into the right roles, we can make a tremendous difference to what our organization delivers and the lives of our volunteers. And just kind of going back to the 5 ways of well-being, a colleague of mine on Heritage Volunteering Group led a project at Imperial War Museum, which was called Inspiring Futures, 5 Ways to Well-being. And what that project did, it worked with people on the periphery of society. So it brought in people that wouldn't typically go to museums, that potentially were out of work, were alcoholics, and it gave them volunteering opportunities within the museum. It provided training, and they were delivering things like on-the-floor object handling operations that really kind of enhanced the visitor experience. And the transformation in those people was unbelievable. I was fortunate enough to go to the closing ceremony, which was run by the mayor of in Manchester. And one of the volunteers said to me, he just came up to me and thanked me, and I'd hardly had anything to do with the project, for the impact that it had on his life. He said, when I started this project, I was almost suicidal, but as a result of this, I've helped rebuild my confidence, and it has allowed me to. I'm going down to see my family now, and I might not be here otherwise. And that almost brought a tear to my eye. And that's the impact that volunteering can have and needs to have in light of all the issues that have happened with volunteering. And I think, as well as kind of increasing the pressure on society and its social infrastructure, volunteering has had a really kind of direct and specific impact on volunteering. So over the last sort of 8 months, we've seen this kind of groundswell of volunteering. So, hundreds of thousands of new people registering to support in kind of things like Good Sam, which is a medical initiative in the UK, as volunteers. And, what this shows us is that people will volunteer for causes that they feel are worth them giving up their time for. But people don't want to go through months of recruitment, which is where we are, having built this kind of professional edifice around our volunteer programs. You have an interview, you have selection panels, you come to training, you have role specific training. It's not uncommon for it to take 2 months to get started. And people want to see the difference they make through their volunteering. But if we can, take this and reflect this in volunteer programs in the future, then we can really learn from the position that we're in at the moment. I think the other thing that COVID has done for our volunteer programs is, and again, we've touched on this already, is to force us to think about how we more effectively use digital, both in terms of delivering volunteering and also volunteer engagement. And I think that's a really positive. And I would say that actually there are some great things that have come out of this pandemic for volunteering. I think the fact that we're now forced to deliver training online, it saves people time, it saves people money, having to come to our sites to have that training. We can, we're in a position to leverage this opportunity to drive virtual volunteering within our organisations, which has typically been very difficult in the UK. And it has allowed us to deliver engagement activities far more effectively. So, if you look across volunteering in the heritage section in the UK, you'll see that people are doing things like quiz nights, regular volunteer coffee afternoons, meetings with senior management teams. They're providing far more regular bulletins and updates for volunteers, and all this makes volunteers feel more connected to our museums, and in turn will help them to deliver more for us as well. So I think it's had, COVID has had a profound impact on volunteering in the UK, but it doesn't need to all be bad. I think there's some real positives that we can take away from it for the future.
Thank you, Matthew. I thought, well, it was mentioned that Yulia said that a person wants to feel engaged. In cultural spheres, or in heritage, people, it makes them feel better. But going back to the psychological aspects, I think, again, art, high culture, has therapeutical effects, therapeutical benefits. I mean, dealing with something, with beautiful things, with important things, serious things. Or let's say we had a big volunteer project to digitize Tolstoy manuscripts, and someone told me if I had read those texts 30 years ago, my life would look completely different, because we're dealing with major cultural values, and they have psychological impacts. And Oksana Moroz, so could you please comment on the new ethics and new sensibilities that emerge? Well, I think that we do have Nana's beautiful text about well-being and about how volunteer programs can and indeed are therapeutical, and how it's linked to international and international research. But I think that digital development presents a great opportunity to engage people who feel abandoned, socially deprived, who suffer from lack of communication. And it raises the question, the question about digital volunteering being tightly linked to inclusion and diversity, because people under lockdowns who are most likely to be in the most difficult situation, because they can't leave their homes, because they have they are targeted, this 65 plus, or the silver age volunteers. They are vulnerable, and they are, well, if volunteering, if we think about it as socially responsible behavior, it's of great use not only to the museums for their survival, but also to delegate or to communicate to individuals a sense of stability, meaningfulness, involvement, engagement. It doesn't matter how old you are, basically. Thank you. Well, we were planning to have a third part of this talk, but we're supposed to finish in 3 minutes. But let's try to have a peek for a couple of minutes into that part. And let me remind you that there is a broadcast on Facebook page of the Association of Cultural Managers, and those who watch us, please ask questions and write comments. Could we spend little time trying to predict the future? What are we expecting from the museum volunteering? What are our dreams? And what is that beautiful beyond, or beautiful afterwards, that we want to get to? Well, Georgi, please very briefly try to outline the issue, and then we will have brief comments. Well, briefly for 20 minutes, as always. Well, in the early 80s, Georges-Henri Rivière, the organizer of one of the first ecological museums in the world and in France, said that the museum that engages population to all the activities, collection expansion, all types of activities, as well, volunteers, potential staff members. So this complex of the ecological museum, this creates a mirror for the population, a historical mirror, and, well, an identity mirror as well. And that was a great breakthrough and it happened 40 years ago. So now, I guess we have an opportunity to leap into, to get behind the mirror, to think about how a volunteer, as a member of a community, to what extent he or she is the mirror of the museum and is reflected inside the museum, so how the system works. I think that the perspective and the promise is to fine-tune all sorts of systems that deal with this, the place where volunteering programs emerge, and this systematic approach should be safeguarded or should be protected from excessive regulation, because in our specific case, in our country, we do have the system, we do have the concept fighting with excessive regulation. And the last point, in the pandemic, indeed, it's here, and it's here for long, I suppose. And those are changes that are irreversible in the economy, in culture as well. So the thing is that we need to adjust. We need to not to wait till it's over, until we can back to the old situation. Yes, I understand you, but I think no one really hopes by now that it's just gonna end and we're gonna go back to the old ways. But the museum is not going to become a remote factory, or no one hopes that a museum will become a distributed museum. Museum can or can't it to get to people's apartments. So it's a new type of behavior, new way of acting, new way of agency for the museums and for museum volunteers as well. So it's something in between, that shouldn't be regulated excessively.
It's not boxed as a specific museum practice. It is not on the agenda for the museum community. This is something we could and should use for volunteering, and this in-between and multipolar practices that can be distributed and that can link various spheres and micro-influence or heavily influence museums' lives. I think this is their long-term perspective, and we need to work on. Thank you, Georgi. We will need to wrap up soon, and would ask Oksana Orecheva to say some concluding words. Maybe if somebody wants to talk about the future, Alexei, maybe you have a minute or two to give us, short comment. To continue, we need to preserve this international collaboration and interaction. It's very important to keep working together. I think it's very important for the museums in Russia and for the museums in other countries as well. Digital environment helps us do that. I think we'll manage. Thank you, Alexei. One more second. The Association of Museum Volunteers is another story for the agenda. This Hermitage St. Petersburg volunteer model has connection with only this volunteer group has connection with international volunteers. Yulia, maybe you want to say something in conclusion. Yulia, Oksana, Moroz, or Inna.
Oh,
Yulia. I'm afraid if I say something, we might go further on. I might further the discussion. But probably some arguments or some results of this research, we could have predicted them, to be honest. While today these results that are based on a lot of data, and this database was provided by 50 regions, by museum staff, wasn't easy for them to get involved in some side projects, and a lot of volunteers who participated in the research. It helps us realize and makes us positive, and that the things we're doing are very important. Of course, we do have some answers, but we have more questions than answers, and we probably need to look for the answers to the questions that were left unanswered yet. What I see as very important is this initiative being the first step that'll be followed by something
Оксана
else.
Мороз.
One phrase each. Oksana Moroz, you want to say something? Inna, Matthew, Oksana? I think I've said a lot already, but what I really want to add, for volunteering to exist today, we need to take to be less. I mean, not to be to be neither pessimistic nor optimistic in terms of technical solutions. Rather see these technical and digital solutions as the basis for the future work. Matthew, maybe a couple of thoughts for the finale.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a wonderful event, and I think what I would say to museums across the world is that I hope that they reflect on where their volunteer programs are and what volunteers can bring to their organizations, and whether they be at the start of the journey and it's about understanding the operational benefits that volunteers can provide, or whether they're much further along and are able to see and understand the societal and strategic benefits that volunteers can bring. I hope that organizations can and will engage in that internal dialogue, and that they'll get to a position where they see the value of volunteering, and that they invest the resources that allow their organisation to fully realise the potential that volunteers can provide. Because if they do, then I think the museums across the world will benefit hugely, and so will the communities that they serve.
Да, спасибо большое, Мэтью. Я хочу
Thank
тоже
you, Matthew. I want to draw your attention to the link that Matthew has put into the chat. Link to the resources, the well-being resources, and I'll ask Inna to put it into the group, the Facebook group as well. I do agree. I think that volunteering in museums should develop, but should not be over-regulated or standardized, not become too bureaucratic, be diverse and sensitive to what local institutions, local organizations and communities would need, and what potential volunteers might need, and to grow support and to grow professionally, but at the same time remain diverse in Russia. Inna wanted to add something. Indeed, I think that the future and something we might be looking for new opportunities has to do with a new agenda, with educational economy, and knowledge economy comes to the forefront, and opportunities for self-education, for example. These are the zones, the areas that can be covered by museums, and museums providing volunteer programs. Another short comment. I think the rhetorics of the future is not that of help, but of influencing each other. How you measure efficiency in or in effectiveness in rubles, in hours. This is something we should look at as well. The millennials see their own investment, investing time into volunteering. They see it as means to influence something. They see it as means of becoming part of the today's society. I think that influencing each other, building up horizontal relations becomes more and more important. You cannot measure everything with hours and rubles, but I think this is our problem in Russia, the issue we have to deal with in Russia. We can't measure it properly. We can't show how important it is. But of course, we understand not everything can be measured in hours and money. And it's not about hours, not only about hours devoted. There's a question from Asya Grankina from the Fabergé Museum, who asked a very a big and important question promised to answer your long question. We started with Oksana Oracheva, the head of the director of the Potanin Foundation, who initiated this research. So you have the concluding remarks.
Очень интересную дискуссию.
Thank you for a very interesting discussion.
Мне кажется, у нас получился
живой
разговор, который поставил больше вопросов, чем мы нашли, наверное, ответов, что уже делает исследование ценным, то есть потому что оно начало движения вперед. Если не подводить, наверное, итоги, а такое, знаете, некоторая рефлексия про то, что сегодня прозвучало. Мне кажется, очень важно, что тема музейного волонтерства сегодня присутствует в более широком контексте. Про общество говорилось много, может быть, в меньшей степени говорилось про другие виды волонтерства, но даже уже в России, в практике, музейное волонтерство или волонтерство в учреждениях культуры – это небольшая часть большого движения. И потенциал этого движения, соответственно, и движения в музейном волонтерстве, он высок. Мы часто его недооцениваем. Про это уже говорили, но как бы вот, это возможность через музейное волонтерство убрать границы, пусть секторальные, которых мы все время, даже используя понятие музейное, да, сразу устанавливаем вот наши секторальные границы, или географические. Мы все время говорили, что нам важно оставаться вовлеченными в то, что происходит за пределами нас самих. Ну, то есть вот хотелось бы, чтобы вот эта тема волонтерства развивалась именно под таким углом, как бы снимая эти границы, раздвигая границы и предлагая нам более широкое видение того, что происходит в музее, в культуре, в обществе в целом. И вторая, может быть, тема, которая, мне кажется, должна найти еще дополнительное развитие у нас. То есть остальные ни в коей мере не принижая, но просто на что хотелось бы и самих себя, то есть как бы нас как фонд и коллег обратить внимание, слушателей, насколько тема волонтерства, культуры, непосредственно отдельно тема волонтерства, участия, культура связано с благополучием человека. Человек просто не может жить без этого. И когда мы начинаем смотреть на все, что мы делаем в нашей профессиональной деятельности сквозь призму благополучия, она приобретает совершенно другие краски. Ведь это не просто люди старшего возраста помогают что-то сделать, а у них жизнь другого качества становится. И вот он еще вклад музейного волонтерства, да, возможности, качество жизни другого. Или, там, если говорим о молодежи, про это тоже звучало, нести ответственность за то, что происходит сегодня. И просто будет другая жизнь. Вот, мне кажется, вот эта тема, она не должна от нас ускользать, насколько все, что мы делаем в этой сфере, влияет каждый день на нашу с вами жизнь. И не только в плане помощи друг другу, и не только в плане решения решения конкретных производственных задач, за которыми мы часто не видим вот эту составляющую. И в итоге как бы будет получаться, что благодаря вот этому взаимодействию, собственно, жизнь отдельного человека, а соответственно и общество в целом, будет интереснее, счастливее, разнообразнее. И, собственно, музейное волонтерство – это большой вклад в такую нашу счастливую жизнь. Ну а для того, чтобы мы это все могли видеть, точно надо продолжать исследование, да, потому что вот здесь как раз важно это показывать. Не потому, что мы про это не знаем, а потому, что мы очень часто в серых буднях, а сейчас особенно осенние серые будни, забываем про то, какой вклад вносит наша работа в нашу собственную жизнь. Вот мне кажется, это тоже тема для отдельного разговора. Да, как это влияет. Потому что давно доказано, что человек намного становится счастливее, если он отдает. А это то, что делает волонтер. Он отдает. И музей отдает тоже, да, когда он работает с волонтером. Так вот, хотелось бы на позитиве закончить, несмотря на вечер и непростую ситуацию с кризисом, хотелось закончить на позитиве, что давайте вместе делать нашу жизнь счастливее.
Thank you for this, positive note in the finale and for spreading this happiness. And I'd like to thank all the experts that prepared this research and this. I think we're in the beginning of a long journey we're taking together. I'm speaking about the research journey, but in general, volunteering evolves in Russia, in the museums of Russia, and we hope it will. Thank you, Fyokla, for we're only beginning, and thank you for the evening. We'd like to thank all our participants, volunteers, and people who work in the museums, museum staff who participated in our research, and will share the public results of the research, and we'll be happy to do that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, and goodbye. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.